What is up, Dynasty Leaguers? Welcome back into another DLF YouTube channel video. Today we are going to be taking a look at some crazy splits that I found using the DLF split tool from 2020 and 2019 for a handful of players, some that are some really big names that I think we need to be talking about, especially in terms of some recent news that has been going on in the fantasy football world. So with that all being said, guys, let's get right into the video. Like I said, we're going to be running through 6 splits on players that I found that I thought were really interesting and that we should be talking about. And this can apply for both, Dynasty and for redraft for 2021. These are all splits that I have found from either just 2020 or going back the last 2 years as well. We'll dive into those whenever we get into those actual ones. But the first one we can start with is probably one of the biggest splits and one of the biggest differences between this player playing with another player and not playing with that player. And this first one we're going to be talking about is Alvin Kamara playing with and without Michael Thomas. And as you can see, these splits are pretty insane here. This is just from 2020. He played 7 games with Michael Thomas last year, averaging 18.7 points per game, compared to 8 games without Michael Thomas last year, where he averaged a ridiculous 30.8 fantasy points per game in those 8 games without Michael Thomas. So, you can see here basically the biggest difference is the targets and his receiving volume. Obviously, that would make a lot of sense just because if you're missing your wide receiver one on your team, you would expect that the running back position in general would get a little bit more of a bump up, but especially when it's a guy like Alvin Kamara, you especially want to get him the ball whenever one of your other star playmakers is not on the field. And that's exactly what the Saints did last year without Michael Thomas. So you can see from the splits, he was averaging 5.4 targets per game, 4 receptions, 27.7 yards, and 0.3 touchdowns with Michael Thomas in 7 games last year. And then without Michael Thomas, he averaged 8.6 targets, 7 receptions, 70 yards, and 0.4 receiving touchdowns. While the rushing volume stayed pretty similar, he got about 2 more carries per game. He was a lot more efficient on those carries, going from 44 yards to 78 yards without Michael Thomas. And then overall, his rushing touchdown volume stayed pretty much the same as well. It was just like I said, that receiving volume, and that is what made Alvin Kamara so great for fantasy football, and for him to finish as the RB1 last year was all of that receiving workload, on top of the fact that he was able to score a lot of freaking touchdowns last year. And a lot of people want to mention about how he didn't really see that volume whenever Taysom Hill was in. I get that, but ultimately Michael Thomas is going to be out this year for perhaps the whole first half of the season. And if that's going to be the case, they're going to need to get the ball to Alvin Kamara, and they're going to have to make that an effort, a concerted effort between Sean Payton, Taysom Hill, or Jameis Winston, and Alvin Kamara to get Kamara the ball, because he is by far and away the best offensive playmaker on this team. And I do expect that he would see a pretty significant receiving volume until Michael Thomas comes back. The next split that we're going to be talking about, you might actually be familiar with this one. I've actually referenced it a few times on this channel as well. But we are talking about Calvin Ridley and his splits with and without Julio Jones over the past 2 years now, from 2019 and 2020. You can see from this table that he's played 20 games with Julio Jones over the last 2 years, averaging 16 fantasy points per game, 7 targets, 5 receptions, 70 receiving yards, and 0.7 receiving touchdowns. Without Julio Jones, though, in those 8 games, he averaged 20 fantasy points, so not that big of a jump, but a good enough jump, 11 targets, 7 receptions, 107 receiving yards, and then actually his touchdown totals dropped down from 0.7 to 0.4. So you can see that, obviously the volume is going way up. He's averaging 4 more targets per game, almost 4 more receptions per game, 40 more yards per game. And while that touchdown efficiency is not necessarily there, probably because defenses want to key in more on Calvin Ridley whenever Julio Jones is out, that's still fine because he's averaging over 100 yards per game without Julio Jones. And that makes Calvin Ridley an elite wide receiver for fantasy football. Now, obviously, I've talked a lot about him on this channel, and, a lot of other people have said the similar types of hype for Kyle Pitts in this Atlanta Falcons offense. I do expect him to be utilized as more of a Julio Jones replacement. So this splits might not ultimately really apply to a Julio Jones-less Calvin Ridley for 2021 and beyond in this Atlanta Falcons offense, because Pitts could be taking 80 to 90% of what Julio Jones was going to take in this offense, that Calvin Ridley is not going to really see that type of increase in target share and whatnot. But what I do think Kyle Pitts helps with is, again, like what we see from these splits, is that Calvin Ridley was actually a little bit better inside the red zone and scoring touchdowns when Julio Jones was on the field. And that's, again, just because I think there's another weapon. Defenses can't hone in on one single player. So with Kyle Pitts being out there as well, and yeah, I think that Kyle Pitts is a fantastic red zone player. Obviously, that's one of his biggest strengths, being 6'5", inside the red zone. That's what he did a lot at Florida. I do expect that because he's still there, that a lot of looks are going to go back towards Calvin Ridley, who Matt Ryan really trusts inside the red zone, and that defenses won't be able to really hone in and play double coverage on Calvin Ridley inside the red zone. Then you also add in, Mike Davis, Russell Gage, Hayden Hurst, the more traditional tight end. There's a lot of weapons here, but I think that ultimately just helps Calvin Ridley because the offense will probably be better, and that leads to ultimately longer, more sustained drives, and then ultimately points in the form of touchdowns, which Calvin Ridley should get his fair share of, near or even past the double-digit mark like he has over the past 3 years. The next splits we can talk about, and this one is kind of something that I think a lot of people are starting to reference now as we're getting into more redraft season, but something that a lot of people really, really did not like about Ezekiel Elliott last year was his splits with and without Dak Prescott. You can see obviously the first 5 games with Dak Prescott for this Dallas Cowboys offense, and you can see this in basically all of their splits in general, but that offense was so productive and so insane for fantasy football through those first 5 weeks that it just was kind of obvious that if Dak was going to go down just in general, that this Cowboys offense was going to kind of not be as productive as what it would have been with Dak Prescott. And I'm not saying that this Cowboys offense could be as great as what they were in the first 5 games. Dak was on a crazy pace of like 700 or 800 pass attempts for over 6,000 passing yards. Like, that's not going to happen, but it's still going to be a very pass-happy offense. Their defense is still really bad, and they're still going to have to win in shootout games a lot of the time for 2021 and beyond. But you can see just from the splits with Ezekiel Elliott, with and without Dak Prescott last year, in those first 5 games, he averaged 23 fantasy points per game, 17 rush attempts, 72 rushing yards, and 1 touchdown per game, and still had a pretty solid floor from the receiving game. 6.4 targets, 5 receptions, 35 yards, and 0.2 receiving touchdowns as well. That all almost got cut in half, basically, in terms of his PPR production. Went from 23 to 11.8. His rush attempts, while the volume stayed pretty similar, from 17.8 to 15.5, the rushing efficiency went down. The touchdowns obviously took a massive nosedive. The receiving volume wasn't there. That was all basically cut in half. Like, that was just such a horrendous last 10 games of the season for Ezekiel Elliott. And I think that's really where a lot of the problems with Zeke are coming from, because we saw Tony Pollard still be, pretty solid to really good in that offense without Dak Prescott. So it begged the question, is Ezekiel Elliott, starting to burn out? Is he starting to be done? He's 26 years old. What's going on with Zeke now? And I still believe that Ezekiel Elliott can still be the elite player that we saw him be, for the first 4 or 5 years of his career, and what we saw for the first 5 games last year, where he was a top 3 fantasy running back over those first 5 weeks. So I do expect Ezekiel Elliott to have a nice bounce back campaign with Dak Prescott back in the system and back in this offense in 2021. I do expect Tony Pollard to be somewhat of a role player here, just because he did kind of have a pretty significant showing last year, and he is, younger and more explosive than Ezekiel Elliott and can do things that Zeke can't do in the passing game specifically. So I do expect him to have a role, but ultimately this is, Ezekiel Elliott's offense, and they're going to feed Ezekiel Elliott like he was the RB that he was, just a few years ago. And like I said, in the first 5 games of last year. So I really put my trust in Ezekiel Elliott to come back to form in 2021, and I like that a lot. Before we go on to the next split though, I would like to say that if this type of content is entertaining or you're finding value from this video, smash that like button so this video can be found by more people on YouTube. It's a great way to support this channel, and we thank you so much for that like. Thank you, thank you, thank you. The next one here is Tyler Higbee, and looking at his splits with and without Gerald Everett. And I know this might be like a really weird split. Why are we running this? But Gerald Everett's no longer on the LA Rams. He's now a Seattle Seahawk. So Tyler Higbee, for all intents and purposes, is the tight end 1 and the main tight end in the LA Rams offense right now. And yes, he's still behind Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp. If they decide to throw to Darrell Henderson now, I don't know. But Matthew Stafford now coming in at quarterback. I think he can definitely, key in on Tyler Higbee and really make Higbee somewhat of a pretty consistent tight end, something that we expected him to do last year, but we didn't necessarily see. But you can look from these splits with Tyler Higbee with and without Gerald Everett. I mean, in 27 games over the past 2 years, he's averaged 8 fantasy points per game with Gerald Everett in the lineup, 4 targets, 3 receptions, 34 yards, and 0.3 receiving touchdowns. But without Gerald Everett, it's a very small sample size in 3 games, but he averaged 21.8 fantasy points per game, 11 targets, almost 9 receptions, over 110 receiving yards, and 0.3 receiving touchdowns. Now, yes, all 3 of those games were at the end of the 2019 season, which was really, the key motivation for why we expected Tyler Higbee to be a breakout tight end last year. And I'm not going to sit here and say that now I expect, Tyler Higbee to be, kind of like Darren Waller or Travis Kelce or George Kittle, like a top 3 elite tight end with his, 8 receptions for over 110 receiving yard splits. I don't expect that at all. What I really just wanted to show from this split and this table specifically was that Tyler Higbee should be a lot better than what we thought he was going to be last year from what we saw at the end of 2019. And that's because Gerald Everett isn't there anymore. And so I expect Tyler Higbee to be the main guy out on the field in a lot of these personnel groupings for the Rams. So I think he's a pretty solid bet to be a potential, sleeper kind of tight end where you can draft him outside the top 10 tight ends and he could potentially finish upwards near the top 5, if not inside the top 5, like what we saw from Logan Thomas and Robert Tonyan last year. That could be the type of track that we see Tyler Higbee go on in 2021. This next one here, this is the next to last one, is actually taking a look at this San Francisco 49ers offense, and specifically Brandon Aiyuk, because he has become the darling player in both the Dynasty and just overall redraft fantasy community from the San Francisco 49ers offense. And because of what he did at the end of the year last year, he was really great, really phenomenal. But I wanted to bring this table up because you can look at his splits with and without George Kittle. In 6 games last year with George Kittle, he averaged 12.5 fantasy points per game, 5 targets, 3 receptions, 50 receiving yards, and 0.3 receiving touchdowns. Now that 12.5 fantasy points per game is still pretty solid. It's not going to really make or break your fantasy lineup, with Brandon Aiyuk, especially given the cost that you would have to pay to acquire Brandon Aiyuk in either Dynasty or redraft. That's not really going to break the bank, and that probably might actually be somewhat of a disappointment for a lot of people out there with high expectations for Brandon Aiyuk. But if you look at the 6 games that Aiyuk played without George Kittle, 18.3 fantasy points per game, 10 targets, 6 receptions, 75.5 receiving yards, and 5 touchdowns. So basically almost all of his stats minus receiving yards doubled ultimately without George Kittle. Now, granted, I will say a couple of the games in the 6-game sample size with George Kittle was at the beginning of the year when Brandon Aiyuk, it's his first couple games in the NFL in total as a rookie. So, he could have somewhat of a learning curve there, like what we saw from CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, T. Higgins. Just rookies in general could take a few weeks to get going in the NFL. So maybe that is kind of what's coming in here, and Brandon Aiyuk is a lot closer to the splits without George Kittle, with George Kittle in the lineup. But my biggest problem with this San Francisco 49ers offense is there's basically not only a carousel at running back last year, but there was a carousel at the pass catcher position. Deebo Samuel missed a handful of games. George Kittle missed a handful of games. Even Aiyuk himself missed almost a handful of games last year. So it was almost like there was never really 1 or 2 or a consistent string of games where all 3 of those weapons in Aiyuk, Deebo Samuel, and George Kittle were all on the field together. And we never really saw that last year. And I think that's something that kind of gives me pause and a little bit of concern for Brandon Aiyuk and George Kittle and Deebo Samuel, that we don't really know what this offense and who would be the main, pass catcher in that offense would be with all 3 of them on the field. I would like to, make an argument for all 3 of them. George Kittle obviously being the most established. He's fantastic. The main tight end and target for the past couple of years. Brandon Aiyuk being the fantastic, flash in the pan rookie that we saw last year, basically over the last half of the year. The first round draft pick as well. He's fantastic. Deebo Samuel was Brandon Aiyuk before Brandon Aiyuk was drafted back in 2019. He was fantastic. You can make a lot of good arguments for all 3 of these guys. And that's what kind of gives me a little bit of pause and concern, because I think Aiyuk and George Kittle are going just a little too high for me in redraft to really invest in that type of offense and take that risk that they're not ultimately going to be the guy, or at least they could be somewhat of the guy, but not like the main guy. They might be fine, but they might not be good enough to where the price tag actually was, and was then somewhat of a disappointment for you for fantasy football. So that's why I brought up this table and why I bring up these splits for Brandon Aiyuk with and without George Kittle in this video. Then finally, the last one, I saved this one for last because I think ultimately I love this one the most. It's the one I've referenced on here, certainly the most amount of times on this channel. And we are talking about Daniel Jones with and without Saquon Barkley over the last 2 years. And you can kind of break this down. This is essentially 2019 versus 2020, although Saquon did miss a handful of games in 2019 as well. But you can see just from these splits, and they're pretty even, and we have a pretty decent sample size in both of these splits. But in 12 games with Saquon Barkley, Daniel Jones is averaging 20 fantasy points per game, 36 pass attempts, 23 completions, almost 250 passing yards, nearly 2 passing touchdowns per game, and 0.8 interceptions per game as well. But in those 15 games that he played without Saquon Barkley, and primarily was last year, averaged 13.6 fantasy points per game, nearly a 7-point drop. You know, obviously a drop in pass attempts as well. It went from 36 to 31. Completions went down from that. Passing yards went down from that. Passing touchdowns dropped in half. And interceptions actually went up just slightly from 0.8 to 0.9 interceptions per game. So you can see just overall, Daniel Jones is not as good when you take away one of his biggest playmakers in the offense. And I mean, that makes sense just in general. So now Daniel Jones gets Saquon Barkley back in 2021, but then you also add in Kenny Golladay, a fantastic alpha wide receiver that they added in free agency, gave a monstrous contract to, and is going to be by far the best wide receiver that Daniel Jones has played with in the NFL, and will relegate Sterling Shepard back down to his primary slot role where he really thrives. It will relegate Darius Slayton to be more of a complementary outside piece. They drafted Kadarius Toney, who I don't necessarily believe in, but you know, whatever he does is certainly going to help Daniel Jones as well. Evan Ingram is still fine. He's underrated. He had over 100 targets last year, just didn't really find the end zone. I think he's just still fine, again, not as like the main guy, but as a complementary role player type of piece. And then obviously Saquon Barkley out of the backfield, as I mentioned. I think this Giants offense is going to be a lot better than what a lot of people expect them to be. I think Daniel Jones is going to be a lot better than what people expect him to be, because I still don't believe that we know if he's good or not. I don't know that we know that yet. And I can't say for sure that he is or is not good. And I want to see, and so I'm giving 2021 to Daniel Jones to really see as a litmus test what kind of quarterback Daniel Jones is, with a complementary piece of weapons and Saquon Barkley back, Kenny Golladay, an actual wide receiver, and then all of his other receivers that he had, you know, in and out of games over the past 2 years. I really want to see what Daniel Jones can do, because if he can do what he was doing, averaging 20 fantasy points per game with Saquon Barkley, if he does that again in 2021, his value is going to go up, and that is the type of quarterback that I want to invest in, especially in Dynasty, whenever his price is so low right now. And I also like him as a redraft shot, just to see what you have in him in redraft for just 2021. I like him in both formats, and so that's why I keep wanting to talk about Daniel Jones and kind of pumping him up, because I think that he's going to take a pretty solid jump in year 3. I don't know if it's going to be like a Josh Allen type jump, but I think it's going to be pretty good, and it's going to be what a lot of people are not expecting from Daniel Jones. But I am all here for it, and I'm really excited to see ultimately what he can do. As long as he just bumps those turnovers down too, man. Those turnovers are rough. So if he can bump those down with his new weapons, we should be looking good for Daniel Jones. So that is it. That is the splits that I wanted to share with you guys using the DLF Player Splits app. You can go check that out if you are a premium DLF subscriber over at dynastyleaguefootball.com, and you can check out and play around with the splits and do your own type of analysis and get those tables that I got just in this video alone as well too. If you want to see a fun exercise and video on predicting the 2023 QB1, RB1, wide receiver 1, and tight end 1 in DLF Dynasty ADP, you can go check that out right there. And with that all being said, guys, thank you all so much for watching, and we'll catch y'all later.